over Eduardo.
Yeah.
I thought that went really, really well.
It was very interesting. Um, I definitely enjoyed it. Um, it is amazing to hear people's opinion, and um, it obviously here everybody knows the history, right? Because we went over it at nauseum. And when you go onto one of those spaces, you're going to inevitably encounter people who still have the narrative history that's been fed to us. And I always find it interesting talking to those people. So, but as I made obvious, when you try to talk in a conversation, and you're talking about the approved narrative of history instead of the actual history as we now know it, I'm always going to push back on that. So it was definitely a lively conversation, and I definitely enjoyed it. So anyway, and it's funny because
Absolutely, and that's,
go
you
ahead.
know, we all at one point, we've all woke up at different points, and I think, some people, most of the people, especially in the space, is there for a reason to learn. And even when they maybe disagreed and started parroting the normal narrative, those seeds planted that day will take root and grow, because all of a sudden they're like, well, I've never heard this, or I never thought of it this way.
Right.
And you know, heck, that's how we all got here.
And obviously the common interpretation when I talk about the history and what our State Department, what the CIA, and all of their fronts have done, people get the impression that I'm trying to defend whatever country I'm talking about. And that's not ever the impression that I intend. And I find myself constantly having to say, no, I'm not pro this or pro that or whatever. I'm just wanting to tell you what the actual history is. And when you understand what the actual history is, there are people and generations of people that don't like us. They don't like the country, not us personally. And they have every right to feel that way because our government has been out of control. And it's weird because all of these same people sit here day after day on social media saying our government's out of control. But then when you say your government's out of control in another country, and we're doing the same nefarious things in other countries that is now being displayed in full color here, they're like, oh, well, what do you mean they've been doing that for the last 80 years? They've been doing it for the last 80 years around the world. They brought all of their techniques and processes home. Nothing that we are seeing here today is new. What we are seeing is it applied to us. So, enough about that. All right. We're on chapter 6, and chapter 6 starts off with a man by the name of Charles Burke Elbrick, Elbrick. He's the newly appointed ambassador to Brazil. So we've now been through 3 of them. He was an old school diplomat, and Elbrick's origins come from Louisville, Kentucky. He went to Williams College, and he joined the diplomatic corps 2 years after he graduated. He worked his way up through Panama and Haiti, which I find very interesting given the operations that we've done there. Um, and just before World War II, he was in Poland, which again is very interesting. Elbrick and his wife Elvira, that's an interesting name, um, was used to the finer things in life, like the ballet, the orchestra, and that type of thing. Elbrick had joined the in crowd clubs in Washington, D.C. during his assignments in the district, such as the Metropolitan Club, the Chevy Chase Club. And a lot of these clubs were famous for, because they talk about them a lot in Frank Wisner's book. They were notorious for State Department and CIA people to intermix with each other and conduct business off duty. So, during Lyndon Johnson's administration, Lincoln Gordon's service in Brazil had been rewarded with the job of Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America Affairs. So he got promoted. Lincoln Gordon was the ambassador during the coup in Brazil, and he was rewarded for that with a promotion. John Tuthill, his successor in Brazil, was not as well thought of in the State Department. And his confrontation of some of the military generals that had supported the coup didn't go over real well. Now, Elbrick was taken under Gordon's wing, and prior to his departure, he was given a cram course by none other than Lincoln Gordon in Brazil's quote unquote history. July 1969, Elbrick arrives in Brazil. At the embassy, Elbrick's reputation had preceded him, and the fears of his new staff were not eased when Mrs. Elbrick explained firmly that a charity reception previously scheduled for the ambassador's residence had to be canceled because she was not making her home open to anyone. Although Brasilia had now been the capital of the country for over a decade, the embassies all still resided in Rio. Elbrick went on living in the official residence in Rio's district. He also had a chauffeur whose last name, or it's Custodio Abel de Salvo. That's the name of his chauffeur. The resident was in the middle of a one-way street, making its way down one of them. The Cadillac was suddenly blocked by a Volkswagen that seemed to have stalled out. Elbrick looked to see what was wrong. 4 men yanked open his door and began shouting, "We are Brazilian revolutionaries." They pointed automatic rifles and the ambassador and pushed the driver to the middle seat. They forced Elbrick to lay down on the floor and told him to shut up. They reached a deserted spot in the hills, and the ambassador was told to close his eyes. The year before, John Gordon Mine, Lincoln Gordon's deputy, who had been promoted to ambassador and moved to Guatemala, which is very interesting too, because of course we were actively involved in Guatemala as well, had been assassinated fighting off rebels from his embassy car. Elbrick would not fight, but he would not close his eyes either. So they hit him over the head with the gun. His captors prodded him out of the Cadillac and into the Volkswagen bus. He was ordered to lay down, and they put a tarp over him. After they had driven around for a little bit, he was told that he could get up and face forward, and if he turned around, they were going to shoot him. One of the kidnappers, they took him to a house, and one of the kidnappers inside the house was Fernando Grabera, a former police reporter for one of the newspapers. Fernando was now 28, and his rapid advancement as a journalist in Rio had been matched by his evolution as a man in the rebellion. He had been working as a research editor at Journal Brazil, an influential daily in Rio, and teaching journalism at the Federal University. He had watched the military coup brewing for years. Fernando saw Brazil fall into three major movements: the PCB, the I don't even know, the PCDB, and POLOP. They were very varying degrees of what the CIA labeled as communist. As often happens, the revolutionaries were splintered. The PCB leadership preached that Brazilians must win back their rights through elections. And the other two are basically varying degrees of that. Now, again, I don't know too many communist movements that are advocating for elections, but here we are. In his heart, Fernando believed that he and his fellow Brazilians were far from being ideological. They were Catholics who had lost their formal faith and were now trying to justify their rebellion against the government. There were some people among the different groups that wanted their own coup and weren't interested in trying to appease their way out of it. So, his normal routine was getting up to leave a very expensive apartment because he was well paid and writing columns about the what was going on. And he realized that there was a high likelihood that he was going to be arrested and tortured himself, but he kept writing. Someone in the groups that he hung out with had suggested a political kidnapping in order to get international attention to what was going on in their country. They would abduct an important man and hold him for ransom. That much of the planning took about 6 weeks. They decided that they were going to ask for 15 people to be released and basically do like a prisoner swap. It was getting close to September 7th, which was Brazil's National Independence Day. Everyone agreed they should take advantage of the symbolism as a date. They had rented a house in the northern section of Rio to serve as a headquarters for an underground newspaper that Fernando was editing. They decided to use this house to bring Burke Elbrick to. They decided that using the symbolism of their Independence Day would gather more headline news. So they decided they wanted to make a list of the people that they wanted to release. So they didn't just get some of the underlings that were jailed. They also joked about the Haitian ambassador during their planning meetings. They sent to the embassy a girl who flirted with a young Brazilian in charge of security. The girl, when she was there, basically kind of flirted with the guy in order to find out what the security was like. That's how they actually were able to apprehend the ambassador. So it goes on and talks about the planning of the kidnapping, and the first night that Burke Elbrick is in this house, it starts getting dark, and the he starts talking to the people who kidnapped him, and basically they were kind of passing notes, leaving them in like mailboxes, and then calling on from payphones, telling the embassy that they had kidnapped the ambassador, and basically keeping the U.S. embassy updated on his status. So an all points bulletin goes out throughout Rio that the ambassador has been kidnapped. By censoring the press, the military had tried to keep the population ignorant that these rebels even existed. So, moving on, I want to get to the part where they're actually having this conversation. Fernando had taken a cab to pick up food for everyone, and he gets into a cab, and the driver said, "Do you know that they got that man?" And Fernando says, "Which man?" "The man, the boss of everything, the American ambassador." That's the way they viewed the American embassy, like they had led all of this unrest in Brazil. And Fernando acts shocked and says, "No, I didn't know." And the driver says, "It's a pity that you are so disconnected from reality. Many things are happening in the world." And he kind of just chuckles to himself. So now that they had him, they wanted to start asking him questions. He was here and he was the boss of everything. So they begin talking to him. "Mr. Elbrick, we know all about you." They're speaking in Portuguese at this point. "The rebels had agreed before the abduction that even though several of them spoke English, they would not make the work of intelligence services easier by using it with Elbrick. We've studied your career," one of the kidnappers said, "and we know you have been a long prominent member of the CIA." Elbrick took it as a bluff, a way of unnerving him. He said, No, I've worked in the diplomatic service. I'm not in the CIA." His kidnapper says, "We know otherwise." The truth was that in the 2 months Elbrick had been in Brazil, he had not requested his briefing from the CIA station chief. Others might call it indifference to duty, but Elbrick now viewed it as important since he wouldn't have any of the actual CIA details available to him. But would they torture him? "We don't like to treat our prisoners the way Brazilian police treat theirs," the man said in response. "Come on, Mr. Ambassador, you don't expect us to believe that. Tell us who the CIA men are here in our country." For some time, the CIA station chief in Brazil had been, as Elbrick put it, misbehaving. The CIA man was maintaining a wife and a child in Rio, and a girlfriend also from the US in Brasilia. And everybody in Rio knew this. In Elbrick's view, the man had been stationed in Brazil too long. The few days before the kidnapping, Elbrick had called the station chief into his office. They both understood that what he was doing was wrong. But when Elbrick told the chief that he would have to recommend a transfer, the man had pleaded not to do it. Now pressed by his captors repeatedly for CIA names, Elbrick said, "One officer in the political section maintains a contact with the intelligence service, and he briefs me." He meant the CIA station chief. He was asked, "Who is he?" Elbrick actually gave them the name. The man, after all, had already made a muddle of everything in the ambassador's opinion. What if they got that man too? With their knowing about his CIA connections, the man would surely be finished. What Elbrick had done made him sick with remorse. His regret, could Elbrick have known it, was wasted. His earlier answers had been so uninformed that the kidnappers weren't paying too much attention to him at that point. When they kept coming back to the CIA, Elbrick suggested names of Brazilians who might be CIA agents. The kidnappers decided to open Elbrick's briefcase. Fernando saw that as taking a considerable liberty with the ambassador, but they all agreed that they would read only his official papers and nothing personal. Isn't it amazing how polite the kidnappers are? Here they had better luck than with their direct questions. Elbrick was carrying no documents stamped secret, but he had been on a planning trip to Sao Paulo the following week, and there were files drawn up to brief him. Drawing on CIA files, they had put together a series of profiles of businessmen and politicians that he was going to meet with. Elbrick heard the kidnappers going through his papers and exclaiming at all of the different names. Was Elbrick going to meet with the Minister of Mines? Then it behooved him to know the man's sister was something about the man's sister, who seemed to be more favorable to the rebels. Other ministers were described as being flexible. In CIA terms, that meant a compliment. Helio Beltrao was one example, which received high praise from the US. With the ammunition, the rebels went back to soliciting the ambassador's personal opinions. What did he think of Jose de Malas Pinto, the foreign minister? This was not an idle conversation. Several days before Elbrick was abducted, President Silva had suffered a stroke that sent Jean-Marc rushing into imprisonment. With the president disabled, the country was being ran by the military. Elbrick was new to Brazil, but he had no special fondness for generals, and he thought the vice president should be the one running the country. The minister had seemed disconcerted by Elbrick's bluntness because he told them that. He finally explained that the country was being ruled by institutional acts. Under that, the military was perfectly legal. Elbrick had found that an odd reply. Now, trying to strike a sympathetic chord, he repeated that he had not been satisfied with it. In his briefcase, the rebels also came across a roll of tablets. These they carefully put on the windowsill next to his cot. "They think I have a heart condition." Tablets meaning pills. Which amused him that they were so thoughtful to give him his medicine. They also gave him a cigar. At the U.S. Embassy, the mood was not tranquil. By 5 p.m., the staff officially deemed to have the closest ties with the ruling military generals went to see Pinto. The foreign minister would only say, "We're taking the appropriate actions." His response was very vague. 1 year earlier, with their riots in the streets, Jean-Marc and the student union had come closer than they realized to bringing down the entire government. Only the police and their U.S. advisors and the highest members of the embassy and military circles recognized the disarray among the leaders of the military and the thinness of their popular support. Elbrick's kidnapping would strain all of this once again. It was the army minister, General Ario de Lira Tavares, on whom the embassy rested its hope and brought the greatest pressure. At 63, he was a veteran of the Army Engineer Corps, and the embassy trusted that he would foresee the propaganda defeat for the military leadership in the U.S. Congress should Elbrick die during his capture. The two ministers, Admiral Augusto Rudemacher Grelwald of the Navy and the Air Force general, were regarded as spokesmen for the hardliners. The Navy seemed more unbending, which isn't unusual because that's where the torture cell is. In fact, the hardline was demanding that until Elbrick was released, a political prisoner already in custody was going to be taken out and publicly shot every hour until he was released. The U.S. Embassy staff saw matters differently. Once the captors had decided to set the number of prisoners at 15, the group wanted to free those men and women who had been tortured the most savagely. They made room on their final list for one sick 73-year-old by the name of Gregorio Becerra to show respect for his 20 years of imprisonment under various regimes. Becerra had been one of the very first political prisoners abused after the coup in 1964. A Brazilian army major had tied him to the back of a jeep and dragged him bleeding through the streets of the city. Jean-Marc would almost certainly have been on the list, but his capture was still not known at the time they prepared the list, because remember, when they first got him, they didn't know who he was. So his name was not on the list when they demanded the release. The first morning as a prisoner, Elbrick woke up ready to talk. They had given the ambassador Ho Chi Minh's little booklet where Ho Chi Minh basically tells his story of wanting to work with the US and basically saying, hey, I'm not a communist. I wanted to institute the US Constitution here, but you guys screwed that all up by allowing the French back into our country. So the ambassador tells the kidnappers that he found it very interesting and wanted to discuss it with his guards. Wasn't it a blueprint in reverse for what these young men were doing? He asked. Ho wrote about rural warfare, and they were engaging in urban war. There were so many interesting points to cover, the ambassador thought. The kidnappers found Elbrick's naivety as he spoke of Ho hard to believe. As revolutionary ideas, they had been they had been around for 25 years. Yet here was a veteran US diplomat eager to probe and debate them as though Mao had never lived, that Che didn't exist, and that Ho had not written all of the things that he had written. And it just so happens that Ho had just died the week before. Elbrick's colleagues in the State Department could have assured them that his ignorance was genuine. In Elbrick's defense, they weren't taught any of that stuff. And of course, y'all know that neither are the military. Marigalala, one of the kidnappers, had dedicated his booklet, which later won support among others, to include some people in the United States, to 3 victims of the Brazilian military and police torture program. The ideas themselves, whether from Ho or others, struck the ambassador as misguided but eminently worth discussing. The rebels had agreed among themselves that Elbrick's guards would stand outside his door, not in his room, and would speak only minimally to him. There was a camaraderie that was developing between Elbrick and his kidnappers as a result of these discussions. As they talked further, it became obvious to the ambassador that one of the kidnappers came from a very good family. He was the natural heir to wealth and a position, yet rather than exercise those options, he was sitting in this house, eating beans and rice, sleeping on the floor where it could be raided and he'd be killed at any minute. Fernando was a tradesman's son. He himself might be proud that he had advanced to a journalist, but he never lost the sympathy for his fellow countrymen. Another part of the discussion was Elbrick reminding them that you are in a very dangerous business. You can be killed at any minute. The young man said, "You're right, but a bullet is better than being in jail. We've declared war on the Brazilian government. It may take 10 years or 20 years, but we will win. For every one who falls, there are 100 to take his place." Elbrick was not certain how to process that information. Although he was warming to these boys, Elbrick continued to be put off by their hatreds. He asked about the rash of bank robberies over the past month. They had averaged almost one a day. He said, "Yes, we have to get money from somewhere." Elbrick reminded them that violence never resolves anything, and they would say to him that we have no freedom of speech or expression. We have no free press. We're not allowed to have trade unions to represent us. We have no elections, no forums, no rights. If we want to change things, this is the only way to do it. Elbrick had no response. While the colleagues would stand duty, Fernando maintained communication between the house and the rest of the world. Elbrick was allowed to write a note to his wife, and Fernando left it at a church and then later phoned instructions on how to get it. His own paper, the journal Brazil, lost the scoop because he was sure someone would recognize his voice if they called. As Fernando was dealing with the press, another of the rebels, a guy whose last name was Benjamin, ran information between the House and other members of the other groups. That job took him out regularly among the people of Rio. 3 months earlier, Neil Armstrong had stepped onto the moon. Now a taxi driver told one of the group, Benjamin, that there were 2 groups of men he admired: the guy that went to the moon and the guys that had abducted the US ambassador. At least some Brazilians were acting independent of the US. Everywhere people walked with radios pressed to the ears to find out what was happening in common everyday things like soccer games. Elbrick first knew there was trouble when he heard a whistle up the stairs. His guard picked up his pistol and pointed it at Elbrick's chest. Downstairs, Fernando was answering a knock at the door. On the step were 2 men in civilian clothes. They asked for someone Fernando had never heard of, and he said he didn't live there. "That's strange," said one of the men. "We were invited to dinner." They apologized and left. Fernando wanted to know whether they were truly lost or if they were intelligence agencies. Through the wall, he could hear one of them talking on the telephone in a low monotone. He was making a report. Fernando went back upstairs to warn everyone. It may have been a house to house check, he said, but we have to face the possibility that they know where we are. They waited. After about an hour, the men had not returned. At last, they returned upstairs, and Elbrick's guard relaxed and lowered his gun. But the ambassador realized with a jolt that had it been a police raid, he may have been dead. Fernando's suspicions were correct. The two men were agents from the Brazilian Army intelligence. Neighbors had reported that there had been a lot of activity at the house. The men decided that the ambassador was probably somewhere inside. What the men did not know was that Sinamar had received an earlier tip about the house and had sent a car to park across the street and monitor all activity. Those agents recognized the army operatives, and for one heady moment, they watched them approach the house. The Navy men were sure they had unmasked double agents within a rival service. Once Fernando went out to place a message for the press and an agent had cruised along behind him, later in jail, that officer reminded Fernando of the episode. When Fernando looked blank, the agent said, "Didn't you see me?" "No," Fernando said. "Aw, foolish me," the Navy man said with a sigh. "I thought you did, and when I came back to change cars, I lost you." While the sleuthing was underway, Tavares, acting for the military, decided to meet the kidnappers' demand and fly the designated 15 prisoners to Mexico. The U.S. Embassy staff was jubilant. Tavares received a barrage of compliments on his wisdom and courage. Then late Friday, perhaps because of the success of Sinamar in locating the house, a rumor began to spread that the hardliners had forced a reversal of the plan and that there was not going to be a release. The rumor seemed confirmed. Then the CIA agents around Rio picked up the story, and a CIA officer hurried over to William Belton with it. By the time the rumor of a deadlock had reached Belton, it was 3 a.m. in the morning. He called a colonel in the army and succeeded with Walters as the ranking military attaché at convincing them that the prisoner exchange needed to happen because if he dies, it's on your hands, and basically everything from the U.S. will be cut off. When I left the office, one of the Brazilians said, when I left the office, they were rounding up the guys, and there is a C-130 that is supposed to take them out tomorrow afternoon. By Saturday morning, the kidnappers had started believing that the government was indeed going to meet their demands. It was not widely publicized within Brazil, but 40 Brazilian paratroopers had seized a government radio station on the outskirts of Rio to denounce the release. For the first time, rebels permitted Elbrick to see a newspaper. To his chagrin, spread across the front page was a fax that was his note to his wife. The ambassador taxed the rebels with this breach of his privacy, and they apologized. But if we had sent it through the mail, it would have taken a week. And then they read it. It says basically, "I am all right. I am hoping that I shall be liberated and see you soon. Please don't worry. I am trying not to. The Brazilian authorities have been informed of the demands of the people who are holding me. They should not try to find out where I am, which might be dangerous, but hurry to meet the conditions for my release. The people, of course, are very determined. All my love, darling, hoping we will be together soon." Elbrick joked afterwards that his only dismay had been the sight of his handwriting. The sight of the letter, like the taxi driver's remarks to Fernando, reminded everyone within the house that this was not a private interlude. This was big time. Late Saturday, 15 prisoners were taken from their cells of various prisons. 2 men had overheard radio bulletins about the kidnapping and the exchange. The rest left their cells not knowing anything about what was going on or where they were going. At 3:30 p.m., Pinto went on the air to announce that the C-130 was in the air on its way to Mexico. This was not true. 200 Navy men shouting that the exchange was a national disgrace had surrounded the plane and blocked its departure. The Navy High Command finally called them off, and the plane left a few minutes later. The four-engine turboprop flew the 360 miles, flew at 360 miles an hour and had stops for fuel in two different locations. It was estimated that the prisoners would travel 4,000 miles in about 16 hours. On Sunday afternoon, Fernando and his group received confirmation the plane had landed in Mexico City and the prisoners had been set free. You'll be released soon, the ambassador was told. Once more, they waited until nightfall. As an extra precaution, they wanted to release Elbrick in the midst of the crowd. There was a major soccer game that night, and they were going to take him to the stadium. He also washed Elbrick's expensive silk necktie and gave it back to him, not realizing that it was ruined because it had been washed. When darkness came, they blindfolded Elbrick and the last time and let him down the stairs. Now they were going to drive you to the corner, one rebel told him. You are to stand on the corner for 15 minutes without communicating to anyone. Then you're at liberty to do whatever you want. Elbrick said, why 15 minutes? You've been here 3.5 days, the rebel said. 15 minutes isn't too long. There were 6 of them again, a driver, another man, a guy in the with a pistol, and 4 men in a backup car. Sitting in the dark, Elbrick heard a lot of complaining about the traffic. Then one said, we're being followed. The driver said, should we get out and run for it? I don't think so. They sped up, going around lines of cars. At last, Elbrick felt the tension dissolve, and he assumed that they had lost their pursuers. Behind the blindfold, he could not know that this had not been accomplished through a spurt of daredevil driving. When the Navy intelligence officers saw Elbrick being taken from the house, they gave chase. Through the snarl of cars, they had managed to keep pace with a 2-car convoy. Then a red light, 2 Navy men pulled alongside the backup car. One officer raised his hand until the pistol showed in the window. At that, the rebels stared at his weapon, and then each slowly lifted his own gun. The Navy agents were brave, but not stupid. The lead car pulled to a quiet corner, and the driver told Elbrick to remove his blindfold. They shook hands and set the ambassador free. Elbrick went up to the first man he saw and asked where he was. It was a area near the soccer stadium, and the ambassador had not ever been there before. He asked where he might find a taxi, and the guy looked at him kind of stupid and said, there's one right behind you. The driver let out 2 women, circled around, and opened the door for Elbrick. He gave him the address, and the man swirled around and said, you're the ambassador from the U.S. Are you not? Get in. Turning on the radio, the cab driver picked up an announcer saying, no word yet on the fate of the ambassador, and he turned around and grinned and said, did you hear that? It took 20 minutes to reach the residence. A crowd had collected outside, the curious and thrill seekers and the police. When Elbrick drove up, there was a wild shout. Enough policemen surrounded the cab that they could have picked it up and carried it to the front door. Newsmen from the U.S. television stations crowded around, and Elbrick basically told him he'd have comments later. On the step of the residence, a man from the U.S. Information Service, which of course is a CIA front, was waiting with a tape recorder, and Elbrick did not feel, as one State Department employee to another, that he could brush him aside. So he said that he was very grateful to the Brazilian government, and he added, to coin as an understatement, he was glad to be back. But he could not bring himself to denounce the kidnappers. He could say that they were misguided, that their tactics were wrong. What he could not do was deny that they were brave or their dedication to their cause. At the U.S. Embassy, some men who had worked really hard for Elbrick's release were appalled by his remarks. They knew the strain on the military and that at any time it could be over. Now the victim was saying that the quote-unquote terrorist were really nice young men who had gone astray. If Elbrick's own staff was disturbed, the Brazilian military was enraged. And this was before they found the tapes that had been made. So the entire time that the ambassador is having conversations with those people about Mao and all of these other people, those kidnappers had recorded everything. Elbrick did not know that his diplomatic career was over. When an aide told him that there was a message for him to call the White House, that it puzzled him. Elbrick spoke to Richard Nixon. Everyone was curious about their conversation, but all Elbrick remembered was a formal exchange of appropriate platitudes. With any luck, releasing Elbrick might have ended the chapter for Fernando and his colleagues, since one of the most notorious among them, they had let him out in the soccer crowd to make his way back to Sao Paulo. Their showdown with the Navy intelligence had resolved any doubt about the house being identified. The two cars would not return there. One of the young men made a careless move. He was paging through a classified ad while they were there, and he tore out an ad for a new place. So, of course, they're going to find him. Another young revolutionary had left an old coat behind, a cast off from his uncle, but it came from a specific tailor that they were able to trace. For all of them, their ordeal was just beginning. For the 14 men and one woman who arrived in Mexico City of the freed prisoners, the suffering seemed to be over. In small ways, the Air Force guards on the flight had shown their disgust for the exchange, not permitting prisoners to speak to each other for the entire duration of the flight. If Tavares had not smuggled on aboard a newspaper to pass the time, most of them would have not known anything about their release. Tavares was a journalist, and his early expose on the ties between IBAD and the CIA had earned him a file in General Goldberry's office. Later, he had joined the MNR, which they viewed as one of the culprits of the rebel forces. A prison guard had told Flavio that Christian nationalists such as he were more dangerous to the regime than a communist. Flavio had been arrested by a death squad led by the police inspector nicknamed Chines. They had new procedures for police torture, and it went on for 3 days and 3 nights with no questioning at all. Afterward, they had asked for the names of the revolutionaries and saboteurs. Flavio knew no names. He was tortured again by the officers from the Army, the Navy, and the police. In the torture room, the guards administered electric shocks from a small generator, and he noticed on the side of the small generator, it had a sticker that said USAID. His guards wrapped wires around his penis. They stuck wires in other private parts. They jammed wires into his ears and turned the generator on. The pain was excruciating. For the first 3 days and nights, Flavio was not allowed to sleep nor eat. His torture went forward in shifts. On the fourth day, an army doctor came to examine him. For an idealistic prisoner, the arrival of a doctor should have made him fill with hope. Here was a professional man dedicated to healing. He would put a stop to this misery. When the prisoners learned that the doctor had come only to be sure the victim was strong enough to continue his torture, it was a huge feeling of depression. It was the doctor's job to give him drugs like truth serum as well. He also might advise the torturers to keep the welts and bruises to a minimum. Despite the guidance, Flavio came off the plane in Mexico City with scars around his little finger of his right hand, which were burns from the electrical wires that had been stuck to him. The journalist on the ground sought out Flavio. As a former reporter, he would speak their language. He tried to impress upon them, for all of their air of celebration, the prisoners were not entering freedom, but a forced exile. I am certainly not here of my own free will, he said. Certainly, you realize that I came to Mexico by an imposition. But I think this is a pretty, it is a much better place. And someone asked him if, well, he asked one of the reporters, do my parents know that I've been released? And the reporter, Flavio, said back to him, they didn't even know I'd been arrested. Soon after the release, Burke Elric was summoned back to Washington for consultations with Secretary Rogers and other State Department officials. In their meeting, Elbrick asked them whether the department really wanted him to serve out his tour in Brazil. His superiors agreed that Elbrick's kidnapping had given the U.S. a political advantage. Inside Brazil, it still seemed to have generated a degree of sympathy for the embassy, and they had received letters apologizing for the inconvenience. Why shouldn't he go back and capitalize on that? Within the week, Elbrick was flying back to Rio. He was glad at least that he was not giving the appearance of quitting under fire. But once on the job, he found nearly every aspect of it unpleasant. The ruling military dictatorship was not going to risk a repetition of the kidnapping, so everywhere he went, he was encircled by 20 to 25 military guards. Elbrick was always had thought of diplomacy as a peaceable occupation, and this was a constant reminder that it was not. The U.S. ambassador rolling through the streets of Brazil with a large entourage in front of him and behind him was not his idea of an ambassadorship. They changed out the Brazilian security team as well. Worst of all the sympathy feelings that the kidnapped had aroused in the ambassador would not go away. Behind the scenes, the military generals was agitating for Elbrick's recall. On his side, Elbrick was not making the slightest effort to atone for his public condemnation, for his lack of a condemnation of the rebels. Art Morer, who was a well-connected Brazilian military official, saw the ambassador only on a Friday staff meeting. Elbrick never requested a military briefing. One day, Morrow ran into Elbrick in the embassy corridor and seized the opportunity to ask him, Mr. Ambassador, would you consider hosting a luncheon for the commander of First Army? It might be useful to us. Elbrick said, I don't have time for those people. It could not go on this way. Within 3 months, Elbrick was letting friends in the State Department know that while Brazil was a lovely country, he had developed an irrational feeling about it and would like to move on. When an embassy doctor recommended that Elbrick return to the U.S. for tests, most embassy officials felt that the doctor was practicing more diplomacy than medicine. Elbrick went home. As his doctors in Georgetown was examining, he suffered a stroke, which is really convenient. Once he recovered, he was not going back to Rio. Elbrick retired from the diplomatic service to upstate New York. Occasionally, he agreed to appear on television or to be interviewed. He went on Dick Cavett as an invited guest, and They had him on with the fiance of Patricia Hearst, symbolizing his sympathy for his captors. And that is the end of chapter 6.
That's crazy. Just saying.
Yeah, I'm sure it was just a freak coincidence that he had a stroke while he's examined by a doctor. I want to know
Right?
if that doctor is affiliated with the CIA.
Or how many connections he has with the CIA would be more, probably.
Yeah.
Because it's normally, not just one. And his brother, and his sister, and his cousin, and his children.
Good point. Okay. That's it for that. What do you got for us, Miles?
Was that doctor's name Kevorkian?
I don't know. Just saying. I don't know either.
If you'd let me, Colonel, I just want to thank this community. If you're in here and you know what happened, I appreciate it so much. So, Colonel, I kind of told you what happened with the air. And yesterday, a package showed up, and it's a portable air conditioner. It's a 4-in-1. It's a heater, it's a dehumidifier, it's an air conditioner. Now, it cools up to 400 square feet, and I'm probably living in 150 square feet. So it's going to be really cold in here, but it's better to have more than not enough. So, guys, this community is so generous, and I appreciate it so much. You humble me for, putting up with me, talking all the stuff that I talk about. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Miles. And I can feel the pain of air conditioning problems because, as most of you guys all know, because you lived through it with me, when we started off on our journey out to my friend's change of command ceremony at Fort Hood and visiting my daughter in Texas, it's like 100 degrees in all of the states that we were in. And we have 3 air conditioners on our RV, and we were down to 1. And 1 does not keep up with the square footage of our air conditioner, hence the reason you have 3. And we were in agony for the first probably week before we could get somewhere that had the ability to change out the air conditioner. And as you guys know, they put in a new air conditioner and didn't change the control board, so it didn't work. So we had spent $2,500 on a new air conditioner that didn't work. And my husband was able to call ahead and have a part for the 3rd air conditioner. The fan blade on it had broke, and we had it delivered to my friend out at Fort Hood. And when we got there, he replaced it. So we were able to enjoy the 2nd air conditioner. And we're still waiting on a part, the control board, for the 3rd one to work. So we limped around with 2 of them for the rest of the trip. But the first 2 weeks, we were on 1 AC. And not a single RV park that we were in had a tree, not a single one. So no shade, even to sit outside, because a lot of them had a breeze, but there was no shade. So God bless you, Miles, for people stepping up and helping. That's what this community is all about. And thank you for sharing that with us. So, anybody else got anything? Stellar? Stellar's ignoring us.
She must be preoccupied.
I guess.
Multitasking.
All right. So I do have a I don't want to call it an article, a thread probably is a better word for it, that I'm in the middle of doing, that will be posted probably about an hour after we get off of here. That is going to be a follow up to our show last night. After I got off the show, all of the research that I had done for that show, I had come across something that kind of piqued my interest, and I found several articles about it, and I've been kind of compiling all of the articles into a thread that I think is going to be very eye-opening, and I'll have to tag Dwayne Cates in it because it has to do with one of his childhood heroes, and it has become now almost a sport for me to destroy all of his, and I mean this facetiously, but to destroy all of his ideal childhood heroes, historical heroes. And this one will certainly do that. So
gonna have to add more room in the graveyard.
touche, Bridget, touche. So anyway.
In the funniest way. We've all had, how'd you put it? You used to always say, we all have a rice bowl that gets peed in.
Yes, we haven't said that in a long time.
Multiple ones.
The first year that Bridget, Cousinette, and I were together, that happened on a daily basis. I'm like, not you two, because again, I grew up in the military. I had lots of heroes. And one by one, every single one of them fell throughout our research. So it definitely is a journey. Miles, go ahead.
We're talking about childhood heroes. Chuck Yeager was one of mine. Did he fail?
No, we've not come across him in any of our research.
That's good, because he was one of my heroes. I mean, he was in World War II. He did a lot of stuff. So
you're not going to ask me to go look at him, are you?
No, I don't. But you could. You probably will anyway. I know you. So just on a sidebar here, do you know how big today was?
Yes.
You know that a crypto conference has been going on, and what happened today?
You share it with everybody.
Really big, guys, and I know Stellar was probably listening to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a different show for another topic. So
doesn't it seem like every day there's some big bombshell?
Absolutely. These are times that I'm glad that I'm living through.
Yeah, me too. All along, go ahead.
Hi, Colonel. People thought they would be blessed without a day from my discourse. However, you're hitting upon the word heroes just triggered me, so you did it. It's the Colonel's fault, everyone. Basically, that idea I've been really mulling it over lately in terms of, how the idea of heroes versus impurities versus like sullied heroes, is kind of used in marketing of disinformation to folks. And what I mean by that is especially like in years past, say 15, 20 years ago, when I first started getting psychotically online around, I would say around 2004, is when I started going after, a favorite, buzz phrase of mine, as you probably wearily know, is left gatekeepers and left gatekeeping. And I'm basically, I started going after the ideas of Noam, what I call Guru Noam, or Noam Chomsky, Alexander Coburn, and Seymour Hersh, who were the holy trinity of, the official quote unquote left views of JFK, RFK, and so much of what was aimed at the quote left, emphasis quotes, would be basically this total BS propaganda straight out of CIA's, in particularly Richard Helms' right-hand man, known as I can't remember the name, but it was, it's almost uniformly the catechism is like quoting this top page of Richard Helms, especially in Seymour Hersh, but Noam Chomsky would, they're just like a little choir of CIA disinformation that is lying about JFK versus CIA conflicts at the critical moment of, CIA history, when the CIA was unsweetened 16. So I began, disagreeing with the left gatekeepers' idea of JFK, and it's like then I began to realize, the importance of this idea of heroes. It's like the left was given this or I should say, the left readers were given this diet of complete CIA disinformation designed to portray JFK as, quote, just another Cold Warrior, unquote. And, it was as if to disagree with that official view that was targeting the left with CIA disinformation specifically designed for the McLeftists, right, was, oh, you're a hero worshiper, or you're like some sort of naive idiot who doesn't understand any Cold War history, because, the people I was trying to share a different point of view with were people who had only read the official, leftist
narrative,
leftist view that wasn't really left. And so the short and long of it is, if there's a point here, pray tell, this idea of a historical figure being a hero versus being able to see the context and the historical situation is really a profoundly manipulated aspect of propaganda. And it's kind of important, I think, because one of the things that sort of enables this, are you a hero, are you a good guy or a bad guy perspective, is on the most controversial topics, like especially JFK's years, you have an unmediated political spectrum. In other words, like this group can be reading these articles, and the other group will be reading nothing of that, and never the twain shall meet. So you're almost inevitably, in the most controversial areas, going to get two completely different media diets that is more separate than any other period in U.S. history, because it needs to be. Because the number one goal of propaganda is to prevent mediation. We think of media as mediating dialogue, but a primary function is to prevent mediation. And that's where you get into this whole dualism of, is someone a hero, or are they a, quote, bad guy, without seeing any of the shades of gray. And that's a function of our propaganda system, which creates two completely unmediated, or more propaganda tracks around the most controversial topics, because they need to have different parts of the population getting these total different streams of information to prevent mediation, so that no one can agree, by seeing shades of gray. Sorry, that was all muddled, but I guess I should shut my damn mouth.
No, we get your point. Yeah. Very interesting. All right. Anybody else have anything? All right.
Nope, I think that's it. Just that the CIA needs to be burnt, atom bombed, and slingshotted into a black hole.
100%. All right. So, I don't know what I'm going to be doing this weekend. I do want to have at least one show on a particular article that I found, and like I normally do, I will give you guys a heads up when that's going to happen. I'm not sure when it's going to happen, but thank you all for being here, and I will call it a day. and get back to see if there's any more bombshells. It's been detonated since we've been on this show, because it's coming in left and right. And I'm here for it. I voted for it. I love it. And I want you guys throughout the weekend, as you kind of digest information as it comes out, to notice something that I've been noticing a lot of, and that's messaging. I don't think there has been an administration that has done such a good job. If you notice, there is someone sitting with every single ICE operation that's going on with the details, the latest and greatest details of exactly who they've arrested on all of these raids. And every single major account that posts bullshit, within seconds, they are reposting the bullshit article and saying, yeah, we picked up this guy and he's wanted for these 4 felonies, and we picked up this guy. And the same thing with Christy Nome and the constant, and people didn't understand that at first, especially with Pam Bondi going on television show after television show. The messaging is part of a breakdown of the psyops that has been ran on us for so long. And I just want to give kudos because it is definitely something that I pay attention to, just from a war planning perspective. If one of the things that you're taught in developing campaigns is how important the public affairs office is in orchestrating the press as it relates to the campaign. And from someone who has watched this from the inside, and in previous administrations, whether it was at the Pentagon or from my time at CENTCOM after 9/11, I have never seen a better execution than what we are seeing over the last 6 months. It's just beyond amazing as far as I'm concerned. Miles, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think you'll have a problem me pushing a different show. CanCon had this guy, he was a lawyer, last night on his show on Sit Reps. And we know we've all been talking about for the whole week, the narrative. Go listen to that show. This lawyer will tell you what they can do and what they can't do. It's very important that we keep the certain things in legal terms with our grand juries. You cannot leak information. So let him tell you exactly what he thinks is going on with this the legal stuff that's happening right now.
Yeah, no, that's a great recommendation. Sit Rep, obviously, I've been on that show several times. It's an awesome show, and CanCon and Alpha do such a great job of the quality of people that they bring on. I've recommended several people to them, of people that I know that have been in the military that I think has something to add. I could not give a higher recommendation than following that show. They're both.
I put a link in the bubble chat.
Thank you. Bridget, you want to bring Katie up, and then we'll close out the show.
Yep, I just connected on her.
Thank you. I don't see her connecting. I don't know if there's a problem with it.
It's saying connecting, and it's spinning, but not connecting. Hang on, Katie. I'm going to drop you down and bring you back up.
So, yeah, I don't see that working.
Yeah, it's not even letting me do that. So
It's saying, I just got a notice saying she can speak now. Katie, can you try to speak? Nope.
imagine she's popping out and coming back in. Be my guest.
All right. Well, we'll wait for
In the
just.
meantime,
Did-
while we're waiting on her to pop back in and request a mic, did you see the interaction between Janet Yellen, hang on a second, and Scott Bessel?
No.
My God, I gotta read this to you just because it's so freaking funny while she's coming up.
Okay.
Okay. They asked Janet Yellen, do you talk to Treasurer Secretary Scott Bessent at all? She replied, no, I don't. He has succeeded in undoing everything that was a priority of mine at Treasury. It goes well beyond China. It goes to reforms of the Internal Revenue Service, an international tax treaty with 137 countries that we negotiated, our attempts to evolve agendas of the World Bank and IMF to address global public goods, like preparing for pandemics and addressing climate change. All of that is completely dead. I don't think he needs my advice on that. Bessent replied and said, sadly, these bitter comments come as no surprise. Secretary Yellen's greatest priority when she actually visited the Treasury building was leaving me and the American people with the largest deficit in GDP in American history when our country was not at war or in a recession. The Trump administration and I have engaged China in a respectful and wholesome manner rather than being lectured. Coward. I couldn't even tell you what Secretary Yellen's China policy was aside from consuming beer and mushrooms. And I thought that was just priceless.
Again, they're doing such a great job with messaging. It's amazing. They don't let any of the stuff slide by. There's no playing Mr. Nice Guy anymore. Miles?
Well, this is my opinion. What happened today is a huge win against the New World Order and the globalists. I don't know if it completely destroyed them, but they're probably sinking right now.
Well, and RFK Jr. came out and basically put all of the fake MAGA people in their place, saying that they weren't going to participate in the WHO's latest adoption of all of the amendments trying to take over every country's health organization. And of course, I responded with, yeah, all of you people that have been shouting that, oh my God, we're all going to die, can move on to your next talking point. Because the WHO's recommendations or adoption of whatever crap they adopted is not binding on the United States. And it didn't matter how many times I said that in the past, you still had all of those fake MAGA people out there screaming at the top of their lungs, oh my God, we're all going to die, which was never the case. So I tried to add her several times and it kept saying there was an error to add her. So I don't know what the problem is. And I apologize for that. It's definitely something with either her connection or the Spaces app. I don't know. So anyway, we're going to call it a day. I'm going to go grab some dinner. You guys take care. And I am going to ask you guys to do me a favor. I don't know what's going on with my X account, but just over the last 5 days, it has been under, I don't know what you want to call it, under attack or whatever. If you guys wouldn't mind, please go repost something on my page, because what Bridget has discovered is there's a way to break their suppression if there's a crap ton of you guys that go over there and repost a single post or make a comment on it or something. It somehow breaks it, and then it stays good for the next week or so, but you can just look at the amount of interactions, and it has no relationship to the number of posts I make or anything else. It has just steadily declined. And as my numbers go up, the interaction after some magic thing happens, I don't know. So I'm just going to ask you guys to do that so we can make sure that as many people as possible. And I do think the thing that I'm going to put out in a few minutes will definitely give you the opportunity to share. And hopefully you guys will share it. So anyway, having said that, you guys have a nice weekend. And I will be back definitely on Monday, but hopefully sometime over the weekend as well. Take care, everybody. Okay, guys, I'm out of here. Thank you for being over here on Rumble with us. I really appreciate it. Take care.